The song Kevin Barry still resonates with me. It's a kind of a hard thing to talk about. Still, this is an 18-year-old boy who is hanged, not just murdered, hanged, in effect as an instrument of colonial suppression. There's no other way I can describe it.
After more than 40 years spent living in the UK, Ross Fitzsimons is moved by the history and feels connected to the landscape of his home country of Ireland. This is Writer's Mosaic, What We Leave We Carry, the series that tells the true life stories of migration to the UK.
My name is Ross Fitzsimons. I was born in Dublin, in Ireland, 1957. We moved around a lot. I grew up initially in Glasnevin, which is on the north side of the city. Then we spent 4 years in Skerries, which is a seaside town about 20 miles north of Dublin. And I loved being in Skerries. It's a really beautiful little town, and our house was right on the beach. I used to cycle to the harbour, and one of my favourite things was buying lobsters. I used to buy lobsters from the fishermen, and I'd have them in a bucket on the handlebars of my bike and then cycle home with the lobsters for my mum to cook. Beautiful dark blue lobsters in the bucket snapping away as I cycled home. I went to school in Dublin, in central Dublin. That was a school called Scoil Columcille. It's an Irish language school. I learned from 7 to 12, I learned everything through Irish. The teachers were all also involved in other things. Like my teacher, for example, was a playwright, so he wrote plays for radio in Irish. They then also got involved in an international summer school happening in Ireland for teenagers who initially came from the US mostly. That started when I was about 9. And therefore, I grew up with the freedom of a seaside town. And at the same time, I was growing up with, kids my own age from many different countries and cultures. The image of Britain would have been largely informed by two different things. One was family members who were already in England and in education. So I had 3 aunts, my dad's sister and 2 of my mum's sisters who were nuns in education in England. When I was about 12, that was 1969. And that's when things really kicked off in Northern Ireland. And I think very quickly, a very different attitude developed in Ireland towards Britain. I think we felt that to a large extent, there was certainly, I grew up Catholic, and there was a kind of not a hostility, but an antipathy towards the Unionists in the north of Ireland and how they treated the Catholic population. And that got a lot worse very fast as soon as the civil rights movement started. So one of my first experiences in secondary school, I went to a boarding school where my father was a senior teacher. And in my first term, within a couple of weeks of school starting, we experienced the consequences of the burning of houses in Belfast, which meant that thousands of Catholics had to flee the city and come south as refugees. And I don't use the word lightly. Near my school, there was an army camp. Several hundred people were put up in this army camp, and dozens of kids came to our school and were accommodated in our classes for several weeks until some kind of peace was restored in Belfast and they could return. There was a kind of touch paper lit on Bloody Sunday in Derry when all these people were murdered, was definitely how we saw it and how I think most of us still see it. And as a consequence, I was, tucked up in boarding school at the time, but we burned down the British Embassy. That was our response. I do remember a particularly difficult interaction with a man who only stayed once. I don't think my parents wanted him back. He got very drunk and he talked about his time serving in Northern Ireland and the fact that in retaliation for the murder of 3 soldiers, he had killed 3 men in response. And I remain deeply shocked by that evening. But it didn't affect my attitude towards the English per se. I was able to, even in my early and mid-teens, make the distinction between, on the one hand, the behaviour of a government and the army that carried out their orders, and on the other hand, what ordinary people were thinking and experiencing themselves. My grandmother described to me once how the Black and Tans came into the house, and she was a young woman, and they painstakingly broke everything in the house. Every piece of furniture, every piece of crockery, pictures, anything they could find got smashed. I don't know if anything worse happened, she didn't tell me, but I can only imagine. And I think that's part of why, I don't feel hate about that at all, but it really pains me to think that those things had to happen, and they were senseless. They made no sense to me. They make no sense to me. The song Kevin Barry still resonates with me, and I suppose it's a kind of a hard thing to talk about still, but this is an 18-year-old boy who is hanged, not just murdered, hanged, in effect as an instrument of colonial suppression. There's no other way I can describe it. It was a really savage thing to do, and it's a savage thing that the British Empire did again and again all over the world. A song like that has a very strong connection for me in that regard. I learned it as a kid. It describes his hanging in Mountjoy Jail, high upon the gallows tree. And the song says, Kevin Barry gave his young life. He says Kevin Barry gave his young life for the cause of liberty.
Kevin Barry gave his young life for the cause of liberty. I wouldn't buy it for loads of reasons, but I think it was senseless in a way. There was no need to kill someone, because they were a rebel. It was an horrific period in Irish history. I went to Trinity College Dublin. The university was founded by Queen Elizabeth in 1592, and it served the Anglo-Irish aristocracy and ascendancy for whatever that would be, 350 plus years. As a consequence, the Catholic Church in particular didn't want Irish Catholics going to Trinity. They believed in setting up their own Catholic universities, and they founded the National University of Ireland, which took in 3 colleges: University College Dublin, Cork and Galway. And that was where, for example, my father went for his primary degree. He went to University College Dublin, and then through a combination of circumstances, he actually ended up doing his teaching diploma at Trinity in contravention of a direct order from John Charles McQuaid, the Archbishop of Dublin, who, when my dad studied there in 1958, had forbidden Catholics quite explicitly to attend the university. So by the time I went there in 1975, Catholics had only been permitted by the church, not by the university. The university took whoever satisfied their enrollment criteria, but the Catholic Church forbade Catholics to study at Trinity until 1968. I got very passionately interested in music, and got involved in concerts at university, helping to put on various concerts, and it was a wonderful time to do that. The best year was 1977-78, and we had almost all the great punk bands. So we launched our concert series with The Clash. We subsequently had the Stranglers, we had the Buzzcocks, we had the Damned, we had all these bands, and I just loved it. And I started to write about music. I started to contribute to the the student magazine. I contributed to various other magazines in Ireland and got involved in music in lots of other ways. I managed a punk band and we toured here in Britain for a while, and then that kind of fell apart for me, and I got into full-time music journalism for a period of another kind of 4 years plus after that, and increasingly found myself traveling to London a lot and going to see concerts in London, interviewing people, getting to know the people in the various record companies, management companies, booking agencies, and I was increasingly drawn to that life, and I began to look for opportunities to come and work in London. And indeed, in 1983, I was interviewed for and offered such a job as a press officer at a major record company. So that's when I made the move. In London, I did really like and feel like there was a healthy mix of different populations. I had an Irish neighbour across the street. I had Indian neighbours a couple of doors away. There was an English guy I liked across the road, and his wife was Japanese. And then there were different restaurants nearby. There was a Malaysian restaurant I loved to go to, and so on. My primary loves in music have always been reggae, soul, jazz, those sort of areas. Although obviously I'm still excited by, even to this day, I'm excited by things like punk rock. But I always had this affinity with black music and suddenly had this wonderful opportunity to go out and experience it as often as I wanted to, which was great. One of my first big meetings, most of the staff were there. It was a serious discussion about our campaigns, our work on the behalf of different artists and their record releases. I was asked to tell the meeting what my press campaign was going to be for a particular artist and their record release. And I started to do so. And I felt like I'd really done my prep and I'd sketched out the next 3 to 6 months. But as I got a few points into my meeting, one of the radio promotion guys started to go, sure, Jesus and Bigara, Paddy, what the fuck are you on about? And I lost it. I got really upset. And I said, look, I don't need to tell you, but I have a university education. I am an experienced writer. I have prepared this plan very carefully, and you can fuck off. I remember the occasion a few years ago when our then Prime Minister Boris Johnson had to meet the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar. And he said, why the fuck can't he be called O'Reilly like the rest of them? And I just thought, there it is again. We lost family friends to the Troubles. Friends of mine at university lost their father to the Troubles. So I was very conscious of it all the time. I suppose I felt it more from the British media when I lived in London. I felt the repetition of the coverage and the very particular slant of the coverage I did absorb and I found extremely difficult to deal with. By the same token, I was also very uncomfortable with I was uncomfortable with everybody's actions. As I say, if I had to call myself anything in this regard, it would be a pacifist. And to have seen family, friends murdered by terrorists, by both sorts of terrorists, I should add, both communities of terrorists, if you like. They don't really represent the communities, but they like to pretend they did. And to have witnessed British Army violence as well. I'm still very sensitive to the whole topic. I actually found myself, really experiencing deep sorrow on occasion at the loss of life that happened. And to me, almost all of it seemed to me needless. The process leading up to and the occasion of the Good Friday Agreement in particular, and then the subsequent adoption of the agreement by the vast majority of the population in Northern Ireland, was actually something very joyful. I got a job interview for what was quite a senior cultural post in Ireland. And it came down to the fact that it was me or the other guy who was going to get the job. And I'm talking to I suppose what you'd call the search guy who is managing the recruitment process. And he goes quiet for a week or so, and then I finally get him on the phone, and he says, yeah, they've gone with the other guy. And I said, well, can you tell me why? And he said, when it came down to it, you were seen as the foreign candidate. That was a hard one to take, and it happened actually around the same time as my dad died. So there was all sorts of stuff mixed up in that process, I guess. I had a school reunion in September, and it was, I think, it must have been 50 years since I left school. I didn't have anywhere to stay. A chap I'd been to school with and had last seen before that, about 10 years before, he messaged me directly and he said, come and stay with us. And it was a lovely experience because suddenly I was welcomed back in. I really did feel accepted and welcomed and looked after. And actually, it's kind of changed a feeling of mine about spending more time in Ireland, because I was feeling less certain. I definitely want to spend more time in Ireland. Whether I move there, I don't know. One piece that always resonates with me, I love the singer Christy Moore. There's a lovely song that his brother Barry wrote called "The City of Chicago," and that's about immigrants. And I suppose it's listening to the, he says, in the city of Chicago, as the evening shadows fall, he says, there are people dreaming of the hills of Donegal. And it is that's a sense of home, that's a sense of rootedness, that's a sense of just feeling immediately, not just comfortable, but a connection to a landscape and a seascape and the colours and the light and the rock and whatever, the people, whatever it might be. It's something that I just plug into immediately. I kind of find it in places in England, but and much as there are places I love here, it still doesn't resonate in the same way. That's kind of who I am.
Ross Fitzsimons was talking to Colin Grant.